We might start now. Welcome everyone to the lecture and book launch of the International Classroom Lexicon Project. My name is Esther Chan, and I'm a lecturer at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and I will be chairing today's session. A reminder that this event is streamed live and will also be recorded. In the spirit of reconciliation, the University of Melbourne acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which of our campuses are situated. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who have made a contribution to the life of the university community. This session will begin by a lecture given by Carmel Mesiti about the International Classroom Lexicon Project. The lecture will go for around 45 minutes. There will be a Q&A segment after that for people who have questions for Carmel about her lecture. This will be followed by the launching of the book, which is the culmination of the research and learnings from the project. The 4 editors of the book will form part of a panel who will answer questions about the book and the project in general. Let me first introduce Carmel. Carmel and I are co-leaders of the International Community of Classroom Research Hub, the ICCR, along with Professor Jan van Derl. Carmel is lecturer in mathematics education at the University of Melbourne. She has taught in mathematics primary, secondary, and master's education programs at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. She has worked as a research fellow on several ARC-funded international research projects at the International Centre for Classroom Research, including the 16-country Learner's Perspective Study. Carmel's research has centered on exploring, through international video-based research, the nature of teaching and learning in mathematics classrooms. In 2017, she was awarded the MGSE Research Leadership Excellence Award in recognition of outstanding contribution to a program of internationally significant research. Carmel is project manager of the International Classroom Lexicon Project, directed by our much loved and missed colleague, Professor David Clarke. In today's lecture, Carmel will share how the lexicons were documented and refined, her analyses involving the Australian lexicon and its comparison with others, as well as current work in the move towards an international lexicon. During the lecture, please feel free to post your questions to Carmel in the Q&A window. Now it is my pleasure to invite Carmel to give her lecture on the Lexicon Project.
Hello everyone. I will share my screen as the first thing. And so I am looking at everyone and I suspect that you can all see it. Yes, great. I'm really happy to be here. This has been a long time coming and we've been wondering how we would do the book launch. And I was giving a public lecture on behalf of the MSTED group at MGSE, and Wee Tiong had a really nice idea of combining this lecture with the launch, which is a conversation with the editors. So I'm very grateful to have you all here. Thank you, Esther, for the introduction. And yes, I'll, like I said, post questions and we'll get started. So the International Classroom Lexicon Project, well, this lecture, actually, I would like to dedicate it to David, my colleague, mentor and friend. And certainly it was David who conceived of this project and who directed it and who was also able to attract research money in order to fund it. This project started with the recognition that there are educational terms related to classroom practice that may not have a reasonable English translation or has never made the transition to educational literature in English, these constructs in other languages. David, I'd like to share a story with you. David used to recount conversations he'd have with his international colleagues. Of course, as you know, Professor David Clarke worked internationally for very many years, and he liked to tell the story of when he and Yoshi Shimizu, who I'm sure is in the audience, were watching a video of Australian maths teachers and Year 8 maths classroom. And Yoshi commented, "Your teachers are never still. They're always walking around the room." And he said to David, "We have a word for this." And that really struck David. It certainly started a study about Kikan Chido, but it also, I think, David's been thinking about language and these educational constructs that have been are in other communities or not identified, exactly right in English. So I think there was an idea and a love of language that was long before this project actually began. So what is this project about? We documented the professional vocabulary of teachers. So these are the words that teachers use to talk about the classroom. So these are the words that teachers use in conversation with their colleagues to talk about the problems of practice. So what do they look like? So I'll start with an example of a few of them so you know exactly what we're documenting here. This is from the Australian lexicon, differentiating, and you're probably very familiar with this. And if you are not from Australia, what I want you to think about, or wherever you are in the world, think about whether these terms, whether you have an equivalent in the language of your community. So differentiating, any action in which instruction is modified, adapted or varied to cater for student differences. Sicilem objevit, with the aim to discover, which is a Czech term. And it refers to the occasion when by solving the problem, students discover something new. One of my favorites is duorauha, which is from the Finnish lexicon, good working climate. And this refers to the conditions in the class that allow for focused studying, but it doesn't actually necessarily mean a quiet class. A term from the Japanese lexicon, bansho, translates loosely as the effective use of the chalkboard. And the purpose of this practice is to maintain on the board the written progression of the entire lesson. And Yoshi has said that by minimizing the need to erase anything that was recorded at the board, students and teachers have access to this visible record that's suitable for reflection. So then students are able to access this, what happened across the entire lesson, and that's very important to them. I have been practicing how to say this. Ketang shung chung. I think maybe not so good. But anyway, this is a Chinese term from the Chinese lexicon, and it refers to the occasion when the teacher makes full instructional use of an unexpected event beyond the intended plan for the lesson. So you can see how rich this terminology is. And when, as an example here, where in English you have to write a paragraph in order to explain what the practice is, it's clear that it's not named, for example, by Australian teachers, as an example in this case. So these are the sorts of terms that we're documenting. This is the term. We also have an operational definition, is what we refer to it, that really gives you an idea or a fullness of the description of the term. So there's a description with examples and non-examples. And this is what you actually will find in the book. So let's start, because my lecture today, I'm going to kind of use the Australian lexicon as an illustrative example. And so some of the references that I do make are about the Australian lexicon. So in the research about the vocabulary of teachers in English, so this is about in English, what we found is that researchers agreed that teachers do acquire a professional vocabulary, but however, this language of practice, you know, something that involves, you know, a whole framework with a category system, you know, the naming of parts of this, it appears underdeveloped in teaching. So this is undeveloped in English. And this is not necessarily true of the lexicons we've documented around the world. And one explanation for this is that our teaching culture, well, Raywin Connell will argue that it doesn't appear to support informal learning opportunities and engagement. So there's not a lot of time devoted to that. And Maggie argues that this in fact results in a language of practice that remains flat or non-existent. And again, this is not necessarily true of lexicons from other communities. So why should we be studying lexicons? Well, we feel that a documented lexicon would help foster professional discussions about practice. So if you think about, I'm sure you're all familiar with the tradition of lesson study, that documenting this language will assist in the development of a well-articulated lexicon that will have value to the profession. And in fact, Pam Grossman and her colleagues have argued that it's the sharing of a common language that characterizes successful learning communities. Excuse me. So the theoretical position that we've adopted for the lexicon project is that of linguistic relativity. So it's a recognition that there are differences amongst languages and that these differences may influence our thinking, our behaviour, and hence our lived experience. Now, this notion that language shapes thought has been much debated, and what we're offering here, the linguistic relativity position, is a weaker interpretation of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that has been favoured recently ahead of other interpretations. That is, that the differences in language influence our thinking. Here's a question for you. If a teacher's conception of the mathematics classroom is constructed around activities that they can name, then might it follow that they are unlikely to engage in activities that they cannot name? And certainly it would seem difficult to reflect on a practice for which we have no name. So in today's presentation, I am going to go through the project-wide research design. I'll share some analyses on the Australian lexicon. There's some work that's been done in comparing lexicons, and much more recent work is on a work with some colleagues in moving towards an international lexicon and what that might actually mean. So let's start with the research design. The research question is, or was, what are the terms that teachers use to describe the phenomena of the middle school maths classroom? So we have been utterly blessed with this project. I think we have a wonderful community, 10 research teams from around the world, including Chile and the US, Japan, Korea and China, Finland, Germany, France, and the Czech Republic. And these, I've listed here the lead researchers from each of those national teams. But of course, behind the lead researchers is a team that includes senior researchers, junior researchers, and at least 2 experienced teacher practitioners. So I think what's quite novel about this project is that we've included teachers as legitimate members of the research team. So I just want to acknowledge that this work, there's something like 46 people involved in this project worldwide. These are the lovely members of the Australian research team, including myself, of course, and David and Hilary, where we were the academics of the team. And then we had our teachers, Catherine, Annette, and Amanda. So what happened is that each team videotaped a single lesson of Year 8 mathematics with 3 cameras. There was a teacher camera, a whole class camera, and a focus group camera. And they also provided us with time-stamped transcripts that were also translated into English if necessary, as well as supporting material. And in Melbourne, this was packaged up into what we refer to as a 3-er. So the project began with 9 countries. So at this time we had 9 lessons. So they were sent to Melbourne. We created a stimulus package from these 9 lessons. And they were returned to each team. So each team received a package with 9 lessons of maths teaching from around the world. So this was not the data of the project. And this is, I think, another thing that's quite novel about the research design is that video is used as stimulus. It's not data. So the video was used to support the identification of terms. So we started with the prompt, what do you see that you can name? So the essential point was to record single words or short phrases that are consistently and widely used with an agreed meaning. And this very general prompt was crafted so that restrictions were not placed on what could be named. So that is, a researcher might identify a classroom characteristic like the Finnish team did with Duo Rauhan, and whilst another might identify an activity engaging a group of students. So the videos were intended to stimulate thinking about candidate terms of the lexicon, whether present in the video or not. But by collecting a variety of video, we thought that would offer more stimulus. This image summarizes the phases for documenting the lexicon. So we had 3 phases. So in that first phase, the stimulus package was offered in order for candidate terms to be documented as a first draft of the lexicon. Then this lexicon was offered locally. Now this could have been with local researchers or a local community that engaged with that lexicon and commented on whether the descriptions were clear or made sense, or whether that they felt the terms were in fact terms that teachers would use or not. And this sort of validation phase that is captured here is described in the book as well. And it depends on, teams were slightly different in the way they conducted this, but validation was a phase that all teams undertook. After a local validation phase, we went to a national validation that typically was in the form of a survey to teachers where they responded to the question, are you familiar with this term? So that could have been 1 or 2 cycles. And, so we were negotiating with our community, and then we would come with a final draft that underwent a clarity check. And then we finally published the lexicon. And now I know that these phases, there were 7 versions of the Australian lexicon from the draft to the final lexicon, to give you an example of how much, how we negotiated the lexicon with the local community and the national community. Nationally, we gave out a survey, and the survey functioned to collect opinions of the community regarding the extent to which the draft lexicon was seen as reasonable. Now, we were quite clear that, that we weren't going to get an exact, an entire lexicon, that it wasn't necessarily going to be complete. And we understand also that language changes. So, what you document today, you could imagine reasonably changing that in a few years' time, depending on what happens. But what we found, particularly in the Australian lexicon, now if you just have a, this is detailed in the book again, but the green represents extremely familiar and the blue represents very familiar, and then we've got somewhat familiar and then not so familiar and so on. And you can see that of the terms, they were really extremely or very familiar. So we felt quite confident offering these terms as a lexicon of our teachers. So we also asked other questions in the survey, which included one about usage, and you can see that, of course, being familiar with a lexicon doesn't mean that you may use this term with colleagues, and that makes more sense when you actually look at the terms. This is the Australian lexicon. These are the 61 terms that make up the Australian lexicon. The national teams, they varied in number, something like from, I think the Czech had 57 terms, whilst China had about 123 terms, but the Australian lexicon was 61 terms. So I'm going to give you a moment just to have a look at these. So I'm not giving you a lot of time. You may have noticed something about them. And this was really surprising to us. It was really such a fascinating experience actually to go through this process of empirically documenting this lexicon. We found that the terms, they had a level of flexibility with respect to their development and function. There were 3 attributes of the terms that signified this. There's a prevalence of gerunds and participles. So they're the words that end in ing. The terms identify general pedagogical practices, and there's a lack of terms with a singular pedagogical intention. So this is about the Australian lexicon. So I'll show you that again. You've got terms that end in ing. Their general practices, do they apply to other contexts outside of the maths classroom? And think about the idea of singular pedagogical intention. So when you have this linguistic presentation that they end in ing, it means that they function as nouns and retain their verb qualities, or as adjectives. And what this does, it lends a flexibility and dynamic quality to the Australian lexicon. Now, this is a grammatical structure that's found in English that's not necessarily found in other lexicons. So we did find that, that grammar plays an important part to the terms that were documented. So the English terms, because of this presentation, meant that we could have single words, while other lexicons would have phrases to capture their pedagogical practice. What else did I want to tell you? That okay, so there was a lack of singular pedagogical intention. So for example, feedback could be used to evaluate a student response, appreciate a student's attempt with a difficult problem, or guide their learning. And that, other supplementary data, when we asked educators outside of those involved in mathematics, confirmed that the 61 terms identify general pedagogical practices, and that the terms, in other words, are not unique to the mathematics classroom. So if I just show you those terms again, they can apply to other classrooms. It might be performed differently. So practicing in a music classroom is different to practicing in a mathematics classroom. Also, for example, can you think of demonstrating in a science classroom, what that might look like? But what we have is the same vocabulary. And this is about the Australian lexicon. So the other thing, this is something that an analysis that I undertook, where I wanted to seek a structure for the Australian lexicon based on what teachers did when I asked them to arrange the terms in groups that made sense to them and to give these clusters a name. So I wanted to know which words the teachers would put together into a group. And it was really quite an interesting analysis. So this is a sort of data that I received, where they were teacher teams. I was lucky enough to have a university class of practicing teachers that I invited to arrange these terms. And, they would arrange the terms in groups and basically give the groups a name. And what you have here is teacher suggested category names across, 5 teacher teams. And there's some suggestion or some degree of cohesion, for example, certainly with assessment, with behaviour, with management. And what I then was more interested in is not so much how they named the group, but which terms they put together. So I undertook something that you could call similar to a cluster analysis. And the way I did this was, well, I'm going to take you through this for a parent category that I ended up naming affect-related activity. So there was a lot of, here are the teacher groups. These are the words they put within, say, that group. That's the name of the group. These are the corresponding items. And what I did is I arranged and rearranged these groups to maximize term correspondence. So once I did that, I would have something like this. So here you can see that I've got 5 teacher teams. I've got 1 group in each of them. This actual team, I've got 2 groups in there. And these are the words that were found within that group. And you can see that there are a lot of similar terms there. So then what I did is I looked across to see if the terms were common. And if they were common to at least 3 of the teacher teams, they were considered for inclusion in a parent category. If they were common across 2, then they were noted as belonging to the group in a weaker secondary capacity, and terms that appeared only once were excluded. So this is the process that I undertook for all these groupings. And from that, I would come up with a parent category with the terms in it. And adopting these principles, facilitated the alignment of teacher categories with each other and the creation of parent categories. So this is what ended up happening. These are the names that the teachers gave to them, but it's the terms inside of these groups that were aligned, and then I identified a parent category. So this, after having done this work, I found that this is a map or a figure of how the teachers arrange their terms, how the teachers see the terms belonging to each other. And depending on, I was inspired by their naming, but basically we had a group about management, a group about affect-related activity, student activity, instructional activity, learning activity, and assessment-related activity. And the reason I undertook this analysis is because you can give the lexicon alphabetically, but might it also be useful to see it organised in a category just like this? Once I had a look at that, of course, there were cross-cluster connections, which actually meant that there were terms that appeared in more than one category. So again, this is a characteristic of the Australian lexicon and the Australian teacher and how they use or understand these terms. So when you see this, that there are terms across more than one cluster, I think what we learn from this is that context is important to Australian teachers, and that terms may be thought of as having more than one dimension, belonging to more than one cluster, as well as that practice can simultaneously have multiple purposes. So that was one analysis I did, but then I also wanted to understand, how do the terms hang together? So this is where I embarked on a network analysis where I was looking at the terms within a parent category and really thinking about the relationship between those terms. And I visualized this with some software where each term was identified as a node and each time a term was linked with another that was an edge. So when you embark on this sort of analysis, you get wonderful pictures that look like this. So this is a concept map of the terms within this category, the learning activity category. And so what you can see, so these lines indicate whether these words were put together more often. So what you then see, and I think you'll probably agree with me, that we have a set of 4 terms that appear to be critical terms to this category. That means that they're linked together more often. Perhaps they are reasonably, if you think about clarifying, elaborating, justifying, reasoning, they're of higher order and conceptually similar. So what we might learn from this analysis is that there are patterns and trends that are present within these categories, and there might be a hierarchical component to how teachers group terms. And which also made me think about, is there an essential vocabulary? So another analysis I undertook was the teacher's essential terms. Now this was incredibly fun because this was about asking teachers, given this lexicon, if you had to reduce it, and here's my question, if you were to reduce the terms to 10 essential terms, what would they be? So I have a quote here from Marie, just to help you understand how she interpreted the prompt. To me, the essential terms refer to those things that every teacher should have in their toolkit to ensure successful teaching and learning. They are the most important strategies that a teacher would employ. They are the strategies every teacher should know and use, because we know they make a difference in learning. So once I asked teachers, and that's the data, that's the kind of data that I was analysing, here are the 7 terms that were indicated as essential by more than half of those surveyed. So what I noticed when I was gathering this data, the top 7, let's call them that, of essential terms, stabilised after 42% of the data was collected, which indicated early data saturation. So these top 7, in other words, didn't change. They may have changed position, but they remained in the top 7. So again, what this means is that, well, what I think it might mean is that there's consistent valuing of practices that are considered essential by the community. Now, how can we explain this? This is actually, I would think, quite unusual. So to explain, we were wondering why there was so much agreement. So I gathered some documents and looked to see whether these terms occurred in these government documents. So the documents that I looked at was the EITL professional standards for teachers, some documents that the Department of Education and Training put out in Victoria, the HITS document, the pedagogical model and the practice principles, and also the Australian curriculum for mathematics. So I had 5 in all. So the curriculum document was included because of the essential intersection, of course, of curriculum as context for classroom practice. So I used NVivo to calculate the occurrences, and of course I also used stemmed words to capture everything there. And this is what I found. So I'll let you have a look at that. So there's standardized counts. And so you can see the frequency of the terms in those documents. So you can see how highly frequent some of these terms are in some of these documents. So, and sort of less frequent perhaps in the curriculum and in the EITL professional standards. So the choices aligned quite meaningfully, despite some discrepancies, with the documents offered by the Department of Education and Training Victoria. And there are 3 possible explanations for this. And you can think about which explanation rings true for you. Perhaps the preparation of the documents involved a high level of consultancy with teachers, or teachers are attentive to and make frequent use of published resources, or perhaps somewhere in between, there's a culture of teaching practice that's reflective of a community. And these documents, they both reflect and shape the vocabulary that arises from the field. So I'll leave you to ponder that, and I will move on to the last section that I want to talk about, how we might compare lexicons. So there were 2 analyses. We started the comparison of lexicons quite early on because we wanted to know what's similar and what's different. So for both, I compared, not just me, but we compared the Australian lexicon, firstly with the Czech lexicon, and then we also undertook a comparison with the Chilean lexicon. And we basically adopted the same research methods. There are papers about this, and you're quite welcome to send me an email and I can share them with you. But generally, the researchers would independently review the entire lexicons and match them by name and then by pedagogical intention. And then this structured comparison was followed by face-to-face meetings where preliminary pairings were scrutinized. So I want to share some of the findings. With the Czech lexicon, we had quite a number that were identically named. So here you can see the Australian lexicon and the Czech term. So we had 15 terms, which is almost a third of the entire terms in the Czech lexicon. And then we had an additional set of 6 terms that were similarly named and have identical pedagogical intention. Both lexicons identify the phenomena, for example, of formative assessment and summative assessment, but there was a difference with the level of specification. So if we look at assessment-related terms, the Czech lexicon had an additional 4 terms related to assessment. Another example is that of summarising, whilst in the Australian lexicon, we had an additional 4 terms that also relate to the reporting of the main points of a discussion. We also found this with the Chilean-Australian comparison. So once that first comparison was done, we refined our approach. With the Chilean-Australian, we were looking not only for exact terms, but we were also considering containment, where one term was a subset of another term, or where they were interrelated, that is, terms with properties in common, or there was no correspondence. It was unique to its lexicon. So you can see there, that was the result of an analysis that involved Australian and Chilean lexicon. So we had 10 pairs of terms that we could say were exact, where the containment was by the Australian term. So the Australian term was more general, while the Chilean term was more specific. There were 12 pairs, 4 pairs in the other direction. Terms that were interrelated, so you can almost imagine that they sort of cross over in a way. There's something in common with them. And then terms with no correspondence. So here are some examples actually. Group work is an example of an exact comparison where the terms both appear. And then we have terms that are interrelated, ones where there's containment by the Australian term, summarizing, and then one where there's containment by the Chilean term. But like I said, this is just giving you a smattering of detail around these analyses. So let's see how that plays out when I think about these two French terms. And you might want to discuss this with Michèle as well, who's one of the editors. So the French have the term mise en commun, which is a whole class activity in which the teacher elicits student solutions for the purpose of drawing on the contrasting approaches to synthesize and highlight key concepts. And we also have a term in French called bilan, which is also a whole class discussion. It identifies and synthesizes the main points of the maths activity of the lesson. But the crucial distinguishing feature here is whether the synthesis was orchestrated by the students, mise en commun, or by the teacher, bilan. So I just want you to think about that. Earlier we talked, there was a question that I posed that said, if we don't have a name for a practice, what's the implication of that? So if the French have these two words that describe the practice of summarizing at the end of the lesson, yet Australian teachers have the word summarizing, what might that mean? And maybe you can help me answer this question. But what I would think is that the French teachers might be thinking about this crucial distinction and might be able to reflect on that practice and possibly how to do it better. I'm not saying Australian teachers don't engage in these practices. I'm really arguing for what does it mean if we don't have a name? So what's the advantage, or why is it a good idea perhaps to find out what other communities name? I'll include the term scaffolding here because this one appeared in both the Australian and the Czech lexicon. And so this is an example of a term that's been appropriated into the Czech lexicon from the English language. And this may indicate the consequences not only of the internationalization of English, perhaps to the function of the English language as the preferred communicative protocol for the international community. I have examples about terms that were absent. So these were absent from the Australian lexicon. We didn't have proof problem. And the Czechs didn't have feedback, for example, which is interesting, I think. Whilst with the Chilean lexicon, they didn't have the term engaging, as well as these others. And we also can see some of the terms that were absent from the Australian lexicon. So use of humour wasn't there, which again, I just want to point out, it doesn't mean that we don't use humour. It just means that in the process of empirically documenting the lexicon, we didn't have that term. I'm going to finish off just to sort of give you an update on our work with Michèle and Valeska and Yamila. We've been thinking about what it might mean to work towards an international lexicon. What might it mean? What can we learn from looking at each other's lexicons? Because the comparisons I talked about earlier, they're sort of one with one. but what if we have a group of lexicons? What might we be able to do? So this is a paper that will be published not too far away in a ZDM issue that's in honor of Professor David Clarke. That was an idea by Gabriella Kaiser to honor David's work. And I can't remember which volume it's in, but it's in 2022. I'm sure Esther might be able to share that with us later. So what we've done is we've asked ourselves, okay, if this looking for exact terms doesn't quite work, and maybe just noting that, you know, this term is absent, but this term is present, and this term contains another term, what more could we learn? And we actually did some really good work, I think, about, we looked at clustering terms. So we looked at specific clusters, and that's where we started. We looked at the language of assessment, because everyone talked about assessment, but we also looked at the language of mathematics. And because what we found is not every lexicon, and if you think about this Australian lexicon earlier, has language that's specifically about mathematics. We adopted a model where we placed terms along a 5-point continuum in line with their degree of association with regulation and evaluation. And we also determined if they were teacher-led or student-led. And here's a snapshot of our findings. Here are the assessment terms from Australia. These are the ones from Chile. These are the ones from the Czech Republic. And here we have the ones from France. And I'm sure that you can see, sorry, I also meant to say that the ones that are shaded, they're the formal terms. That you could see that, you know, there is a difference, but we can populate them along this continuum. We noticed that the French lexicon has a very sophisticated language when it comes to assessment, but we all seem to have quite a lot of formal terms, fewer terms in relation to regulation. So I will, that's probably all I will say about that. I will show you in my last couple of minutes that we also classified mathematical terms. So here, we were concerned with the language that considers mathematical specificity. And because we noticed it was present in the Chilean and French lexicon, and what we did is we looked at their terms and we asked experts, first of all, whether it was present in the lexicon, whether there was a close term in the lexicon in relation to the mathematical term, whether we have a candidate term or whether it might be absent. And again, this is in the same paper, so you could have a look at that later. But what we found is that we were able to learn from these from the terms that were offered by the French lexicon and offered by the Chilean lexicon, reflect on our own language, find candidate terms, but then also we could reflect on terms that, you know, are really unique to the French lexicon. So many of the terms did respond to practices that are present in the community, but approaching it as a cluster offered new insights. I will stop there with that, and I'll just finish with saying that the lexical items of a community, the terms that they are familiar with, that teachers are using, they're valuable resources. And these essential characteristics can be reflected on and discussed. Once we have these documented, we can engage in this. And we can ask what practices are valued by this act of naming and how might these named practices be improved. This lexicon of teacher practice supports reflection in order to improve teaching and learning. This is the book that we've just published. I'd like to acknowledge the Discovery Grant from the ARC, and also thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing.
That's great. Thank you, Carmel, for sharing the exciting work of yours and your teams with us. It's truly inspirational to have a project that values different cultures and languages, and most important of all, the work of teachers. Now, we will begin the Q&A segment with Carmel. The segment will be hosted by Professor Wee Tiong Seah. A reminder to the audience that you can post your questions in the Q&A window, and I've seen some of you already posted messages there. So let me introduce Professor Seah first. Wee Tiong Seah is Professor in Mathematics Education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, the University of Melbourne here in Australia. He has some 20 years of experience in initial teacher education and in-service professional development across different tertiary institutions in Australia. Wee Tiong brings to academia an extensive professional experience in mathematics teaching and pastoral care across a range of educational settings in Singapore and Australia. Wee Tiong's current research interests include the harnessing of motivational constructs such as values to foster and maintain mathematical well-being and to understand values alignment strategies, which is very important. He's founding director of a 20-nation research consortium called the Third Wave Project. Over the last decade or so, Wee Tiong has also been invited to present some 30 research keynote addresses and guided 9 PhD students to completion. I will now hand over to Wee Tiong to facilitate the Q&A segment.
Thank you, Esther, for your introduction and for your kind words. And thank you, Carmel, for your very, very informative talk, which gave us a very good picture of the whole project, the methodology and the results and the findings. So I'm sure that everyone would like to give you a hand of applause for that fabulous work that you have done in 45 minutes.
It was a lot.
So to the audience, feel free to type your comments or your questions in the Q&A panel. Currently, we have one question there, and I would like to just post that to Carmel first up. And that question is with regards to the observation that the Australian terms seem to be mainly about events that are one-off, and I believe this refers to Australian terms like clarifying, justifying, giving praise. And compared to some of the other terms that you introduced, which implied a sequence process and a subject-specific one. So I believe that relates to one of the last slides, because the question was posed before the slides, towards the end of the slideshow. But some of the terms that are in the Australian lexicon is applicable to all subjects, so to speak. You know, it's just like clarifying, giving praise. It can be an activity that all teachers, perhaps of all subjects, can engage in. So the question is, if this is the case, does this, what is a comment on how pedagogy is envisaged in Australia?
It's a good question, isn't it? You know, Russell's talking about it being one-off, and I think what we're capturing with this language is this, that teachers see their practice in the classroom as activities. It's really activity-based. It's like, I do this and then I do this. It's very active. It's, you know, and I think in some ways Russell is right. It sort of, it focuses on what needs to happen. So we didn't have a lot of the terms that some of the other lexicons did, where they described characteristics. And I think I mean, if there are teachers in the audience that would like to comment on that, whether they think that captures how we work, but it's sort of like, it really does characterize, I think, some of our practice. But in many ways, I'd like to leave that comment to teachers themselves. You know, what do you think? Do you think this lexicon has captured how you talk about practice in the way that you see yourself practicing in the classroom? Or are there terms that we haven't got? And certainly these were some of the questions that we asked in the survey to teachers nationally as well.
Great. Thanks, Carmel. The next question is I think it's a very important one, and a characteristic of school education, perhaps. How do you characterize possible changes of lexicon, maybe in response to the changes in educational policy in a particular educational context or system and society in general, or to the change of teachers' communities, for example?
How do I characterize the changes? I'm not sure what Yoshi means. I've documented the changes and I expect changes to happen in the lexicon. I think Yoshi, maybe he's asking what I might think, why this might be the case. But certainly, I think the analysis on the 10 essential terms, this alignment with these documents that are pushed by the, not pushed, but offered by the government, I think is quite an interesting idea. Of course, we only did like a small set of terms, and you'd like to repeat that to see, well, what's the new lexicon within these documents? So that's a change that I think is either, like I said, I still think that we can't really determine which direction that goes in, whether it's policy feeding back down to teachers or whether it's teachers themselves feeding up to policy, depending on what they're learning. Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing what Yoshi thinks about that, actually. And
in fact, as a follow-up, I think Yoshi just said what I intend to say, which is that is the lexicon of a particular mass education system stable? So if you're going to do this,
right,
in 5 years' time.
Well, I think Yoshi could answer that really well, because I know that Yoshi has written about that term Kikenshido and how it's changed just really in the last 15 years, I think. And certainly it's something where now I know that we talked about this, but he has noticed a change in emphasis where instead of maybe observing in that roaming of the classroom that the teachers do or monitoring, that they actually start to engage and guide. Now, I might not have captured that exactly, but he, and I think the Japanese lexicon's a wonderful, sophisticated lexicon, as is the French one, as is the Chinese one, because what I love about Japan is that you can go to a bookstore and there's a section for teachers and you can pick up a book that has the vocabulary of teaching practice. And I think that's an amazing, something that should be incredibly proud of. I mean, wouldn't we love to have that? And certainly I think that comes, of course, out of their practice of lesson study. Again, Yoshi should probably give us a guest lecture on this. But, and the other wonderful thing I wanted to say about Japan, and I know that Yoshi once promised me a book on bansho. So apparently there's a book that you can find on the shelf that shows you beautiful illustrative examples of what a good board looks like. So what good practice looks like. So that means that the teacher is actually learning or reflecting on, how do I improve this practice? How do I make it better? And that's what we're really hoping for with the publication of this book. I know I went a little bit off topic there, but I hope that was okay.
But that's, I mean, that's a very good answer, and that's a very good response, because a few years ago, we were talking about how these individual terms, perhaps, especially those without context, might refer to the sort of attributes of teaching, mass teaching that particular nations or education systems value. And of course, when we think of stability, from the values perspective, yes, this can change and this can evolve over time as well, as circumstances change. Perhaps we have time for one more question, Esther?
Yep, certainly. We also have someone in the audience who put up her hand. Would we want to call people in or answer the question on the chat?
It'd be nice to hear something. It'd be nice to hear from someone, wouldn't it?
Yep. So Gina, do you want to
We have Jeanette.
Jeanette.
You may need to unmute Jeanette so we can hear your question.
Sorry, actually, no, I didn't have a question, but I'm very, very happy that what you've taught us today, I've learned a lot as well. So thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. Are you an Australian maths teacher?
I'm actually Chilean background, so I was quite fascinated about your Chilean statistics. And I was a teacher last year, but now I'm actually working for Melbourne Archdiocese Catholic School. So I associate a lot with secondary school teachers.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Jeanette, you might want to know that the Chilean lexicon, what's quite interesting about that lexicon is that it's made up of lots of phrases. So the Spanish language, it doesn't have that linguistic capacity that the Australian lexicon has about, you know, using these really short words. They have lots of phrases, which posed a particular challenge for them. So I'd encourage you to have a look.
I will. I'm going to get your book now. As soon as it said Chilean, I think that's it. That's me. I'm going to go and have a read.
That's wonderful. Don't forget to use, there is a discount code, so please use that.
So thank you, Carmel.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jeanette. Of course, Jeanette is one of our students. She did a Master's of Education with us in MGSE and currently at the Catholic Education Office. Just time for one quick question for you, Carmel. And that is with regards to the International Lexicon. And I think that is, I think that's of interest to many people. And the questions, well, there are two questions to that, which is, do you think that the words or phrases are translatable between cultures? And what risks or rewards do you anticipate in making an attempt
What risk?
translate?
Sorry, did you say what risk?
Yeah, risks or rewards. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I might start the answer, but then Michèle can finish because we did a lot of work on this together. The problems of translation, I think, are well documented by linguists. So I may not venture into that territory other than to say, you can't do this alone. I cannot pick up a lexicon from another community and just by maybe reading their description and examples, really have as thorough an understanding in order to make a comparison. It was very, very clear that we had to work as in a team and that we had to explain what the important or critical aspects were of each of the terms. That always didn't come through. And I think this is really fascinating. And this is why the term itself, and I know David's original idea is that it should be illustrated with video at some point as well. And that was like a big dream right at the start, that we would illustrate it with different video from different classrooms from around the world. It would be lovely to also be able to do that. But I'm going to pass to Michèle because she can talk about the risks and rewards, Wee Tiong, of doing an international comparison. And I think, Michèle, if you just unmute.
Yes, it was fascinating, this work we have done towards an international lexicon, trying to build connections and trying to understand. And it was really very interesting to see that words are not just words. They encapsulate elements of a culture, they encapsulate a history. And if you want to build connection, you have to reveal in some way these elements of culture, this history, in order to build a sound connection and not artificial connection. If not, you are creating more misunderstanding. And for instance, for me in this project, it was what is lost in translation became really evident. And but working, we can build connection, and this is very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks, Michèle, for that clarification and that elaboration. Over back to you, Esther.
Okay, well, thank you, Carmel, Wee Tiong, and Michèle, and the audience. It's great to have this interaction after the lecture, and actually that will be more later Now we will move to the book launch segment of the session, and Wee Tiong will start with a video.
Thank you all, it's me again. Wee Tiong, I forgot to say that this video has no audio. It is as it is, so it's not that we have lost the audio. So I hope you have a sense of what that book is trying to capture. Again, my name is Wee Tiong, and I'm the lucky man who has the privilege to host this book launch event. But I think, first of all, a sort of a greeting. How are you all doing? And of course, to many of us, how are you doing might not attract much of attention. And I don't think you want to launch into a 3-minute response to that, because you recognize that as a hello greeting. And yet people in different cultures, different societies can and do greet others in different ways. In many parts of Asia, for example, friends tend to greet one another with the phrase translated into English would be similar to "have you eaten?" And like, how are you doing? This reflects social historical experiences and values as well. And the same goes with the words like ice and snow. For us, snow is snow is snow. But for the Sami people who inhabit the northern regions of Scandinavia and Russia, they have at least 180 words related to ice and snow. Since the need to differentiate different types of ice and snow can be very important and in fact life-saving sometimes in the local cultures. So we can say the same for the Siberian, Yupik, and the Canadian Inuit languages as well. They do have a host of words to describe different types of ice and snow. So how about the terms and phrases that we use, teachers use and students use in the maths classroom? And this is where this book comes in. If you can see, this wonderful book comes in, and I am, and Carmel is holding the book as well. Welcome to the launch of this groundbreaking and instructive volume of 356 pages, which is entitled Teachers Talking About the Classrooms, Learning from the Professional Lexicons of Math Teachers Around the World. And as you know, different communities speaking different languages, employing different naming systems to describe the events, actions, and interactions of the math classroom in the respective cultures. And the International Classroom Lexicon Project has documented the professional vocabulary that's available to middle school math teachers in Australia, in Chile, in China, the Czech Republic, Finland, France, Germany, Japan, Korea, and the United States of America. And this book details the existing professional vocabulary in each of these international community by which math teachers conceptualize their practice and explores the characteristics, the structures, and the distinctive features of each of these national lexicon. So to tell us more about the book, we have with us here a panel made up of 3 of the 5 editors, Emeritus Professor Michèle Artigue, Dr. Hilary Hollingsworth, and Professor Yiming. So before we start, let me briefly introduce you to each of these 3 panelists. Michèle Artigue is an Emeritus Professor at the Université de Bari, an Associate Researcher at the Laboratoire de Didactique André Bourbeuf in France. In 2013, Michèle was awarded the Felix Klein Yiming Medal for sustained, consistent, and outstanding lifetime achievement in math education research and development. And Michèle's recent research interest has centered on the building of connections between approaches and theories in math education. So welcome, Michèle. Hilary Hollingsworth is Principal Research Fellow at the Australian Council for Educational Research, otherwise known as ACER. And Hilary has over 30 years of experience working in a wide range of national and international educational contexts, including schools, universities, research institutions, government education departments, and private education service organizations. Hilary's research interests include teacher professional learning, video classroom observations, teaching quality, assessing student learning, and communicating student learning progress. So we are privileged to have you with us here today, Hilary. Yiming Chow is professor at Beijing Normal University in China and chair of the Chinese Association of Maths Education. Yiming has worked throughout his career to improve maths education in China. His research interests would include curriculum, assessment, teacher knowledge, and cooperative learning, and he currently leads the revision of the Chinese mathematics curriculum standards for compulsory education. So, Cao Lao Si, welcome to you. So before I pose the first question to Hilary, the audience in attendance is welcome to ask questions through the Q&A panel, pane, and I shall endeavor to pose them to the particular panelists. So it would be appreciated if you start your question by indicating to whom you would like to direct your question to, and perhaps, of course, to all the three panelists, and perhaps even including Carmel. So Hilary, our first question for you. What might readers expect to find in this book?
Well, thank you, Wee Tiong, and thank you for the warm welcome, and hello, everybody. Well, we were very fortunate to secure Anna Spard, Professor of Education at the University of Haifa in Israel, to write a foreword for us. So the very first part of the book is Anna's foreword, and she begins by questioning the often held belief that mathematics is a universal language. And she goes on to highlight the orientation of our team, which is really, we regard cultural and linguistic aspects of language as highly relevant to the way that mathematics teaching practice is formed and articulated, as I think Michèle picked up on before, and certainly Carmel did in her presentation. And Anna points out in her foreword that the Lexicon Project provides a really rich source of insight into pedagogy, revealing similarities and differences in our understandings of mathematics teaching and learning. And following Anna's foreword, there's a chapter 1, which provides details of the background to the Lexicon Project and describes the research methodology and design. And that chapter was worked on by Carmel, myself, and our wonderful colleague and friend, David. After that chapter, once we've introduced the ways of working, there are then 20 chapters, 2 for each of the 10 participating countries. And the first chapter for each country describes the process of development and refinement of their particular lexicon. It includes some analyses of their lexical terms, characteristic features of their lexicon, and reflections about potential uses of their lexicon. Then the second chapter for each country presents each of the terms in the lexicon in both the original language and in English translation, together with accompanying descriptions and classroom examples. And I know Michèle mentioned before, one of the intricacies of this work is, what's left out, not just what it was left in. And we had many, many deliberations around English translations and which one's best fit for the original language. So we've had lots of tussles around them. It's very challenging work, but most enjoyable. The final part of the book is an index of all the lexical terms in original language and in English, so that original language speakers can look up the terms they're familiar with, and those of us who unfortunately only speak one language can go straight for the English. And just so you have an idea, the number of terms in the lexicons across those 10 chapters, 10 for each of the participating countries, ranged from 57 terms in the Czech Republic lexicon up to 123 for China. So you'll be able to have a look at all of those, and also pick up on the particular processes that each country used to develop and lead to that final number of lexical terms.
Thanks, Hilary. So there you have it, 10 countries, 21 chapters, 356 pages of nuggets. Cao Lao Shi, Professor Cao, we understand that 2 chapters amongst the 21 were dedicated to the Chinese lexicon. So what has the Chinese lexicon revealed about teaching in China?
At the first, we have that we are very interested in the lexicon project because we do some comparative study, the international comparative study. Because in some activity in the classroom, when we translate in English or some we will discuss with the Japanese or some other countries' activity in the classroom, but we cannot understand what's the meaning of the, just like Kinkishido or some, or by some, when we discuss with David Clarke, he did not know in Chinese chat or Pudian or some Fuxi. So we want to do the lexicon project so we can understand the activity in a teacher's activity or students' activity in the classroom. So, I think this project can we can more understand the different countries, the teachers' activity in the classroom and the students' activities in the classroom. When we do some research, comparative research, most of them use the same words, but in the classroom, but that did not. So when Chinese team, we do the teachers' activity in the classroom and the teachers' activity in the classroom and some students' activity in the classroom. So I think so. This is a very interesting project. So we can do the more and more comparative studies. And in Chinese team, most of us focus on the key activities in the classroom. I think we have a lot of things to do about this project.
Thank you. And then I believe that through the comparisons and the discussions that the research teams and the project members have been discussing with each other and one another, you also get to know a little bit more about the practices in your own countries as well. And as they say, the fish is the last to know water. So perhaps this is the experience for China and for many other education systems. I would like to direct the next question to Michèle. Michèle, when you were looking through the collection of lexicons, what did you find surprising? Sorry, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry. Many things. I found many things surprising. I did not anticipate such a diversity, for instance. The number of terms from less than 60 to more than 120 with the Chinese lexicon. And also what was mentioned and stressed by Carmel, the fact that some lexicon could be used in other disciplines without major changes. And for instance, it's not the case for the French lexicon. And you cannot use a French lexicon in another discipline without major changes in it. Because it tries to capture the specificity of the mathematics classroom. And this makes different from other lexicon, for instance. From the Australian, but also from the Czech lexicon, for instance, as we have compared these lexicons. And I was also very much surprised by the diversity in the form of terms, because we have seen with the Australian lexicon, all terms are 1-2 words. But in other lexicon, you see that for expressing perhaps a bit similar ideas, we need nearly 1 sentence. And this is really surprising. And also the organization of categories. Carmel has explained the sophisticated way in which they have built categories for the Australian lexicon. But all lexicons have their own categories. And even when these categories are translated in English by the same word or very close expressions, you see that the content may be completely different. So it's really surprising for me. And another thing that was surprising for me was the fact that these lexicons capture the language of teachers. And I am a researcher, and I saw that the technical language of pedagogical and didactic research is not very present in the lexicon. And so as if this language was not appropriated or not considered very useful by teachers in order to describe the classroom phenomena. And for me, this is striking. And of course, there are some differences. And for instance, if you look at the Japanese lexicon, you see the proximity between the discourse of researchers and the discourse of teachers, but certainly due to the practice of lesson studies and the influence on research on lesson studies and the connection between the communities that emerged from that. And what I found really interesting is that all these characteristics, all these differences are not just random phenomena. They have reasons, they have historical reasons, they have linguistic reasons, and it is fascinating to try to understand these reasons. Yeah.
Thank you. And
what we try to do now.
And because these reasons, the way that these surprises are taking place is not random, it's not, there are historical reasons. It just emphasizes how important it is for us how much more new learning, new knowledge that we can get from this project and from the findings of this project. Education, school education never surprises us. There's so much more to learn, and this book promises to tell us a lot more about maths education in different countries, and so on and so forth. Now, we have 2 questions on the Q&A, so I shall pose both of them at the same time, and I will invite Carmel to answer the first one, and then followed by Michèle, so that we can give Michèle a break, so that she doesn't answer 2 questions consecutively. The first question for Carmel is that if words are culturally recognized, is it possible that there are sub-national lexicons in use as well? And before we invite Carmel to respond to that, a query for Michèle is that if a classroom lexicon is directed to some end, what might the end be? So, Carmel, you may want to.
Yeah, I actually think that it is indeed possible. So if we take the example maybe of a Steiner school, you would expect that because of their practice that differ, and there are ways in which that would differ from a mainstream school, that they would develop their own vocabulary for that. So, I mean, I think we could think of a number of communities or schools or school types maybe where that would absolutely could happen. I don't have any evidence. I just expect that if you're engaging in practices that might be different, or, you know, if we use the word culturally appropriate for that school, then you're possibly naming that practice as well. So the idea of sub-lexicons, sub-national, I think is what John means, is basically not, you know, other lexicons within a nation. I can imagine, well, everyone has been really sensitive to the fact that these lexicons, although, and really we're restricted by language here, we generated it mainly with Victorian teachers, for example, but, you know, the national validation did go, you know, to other states as well. But we're sensitive to the fact that we really have captured maybe a more local voice than a national voice. So that could be absolutely possible. I could be presenting to you today a Victorian lexicon. I actually don't think that's the case so much in Australia, but I know that the other teams that we were working with were more sensitive to this. Again, you know, we've only done, you know, so much work with the resources that we had, but I would be really, really interested to investigate, you know, lexicons used by, you know, other communities, you know, rural communities, First Nation communities. I mean, I think that would be a fascinating study to engage in. So the short answer is it possible? I think yes, John. I think yes.
Okay, thanks, Carmel. Michèle?
I think that we can use in different ways these lexicons, and also to think them as dynamic objects. And for me, what was really interesting, and when we work with teachers or with colleagues with a lexicon, what is fascinating is to see how to look at our lexicon seen from the outside with another perspective. Because comparing the lexicon, you see at the same time the potential of your lexicon, but also the limitation of your lexicon. And for instance, if I consider the French lexicon, you can see that there is a lot of terms that French teacher, mathematics teacher have for labeling the type of task, for differentiating the type of mathematical task they propose to students. They have a lot of terms, nearly 20 terms for that. And they have a lot of terms for denoting the mathematical activities in the class. And so they are rich for that. But for the affective dimension of the class, for the professional gesture, the professional techniques that teachers have in order to create a good climate of class, the lexicon is very poor. So at the moment, we are, a master student of us is trying to investigate in all lexicon how this affective dimension of learning and teaching practices is represented. What are the words existing? What does it try to convey? And in order to see what we can do with this lexicon in order to enrich our own perspectives, not just with the language of researchers, but with the language of teachers in other countries on their practice. And I think this is a possibility of use of the lexicon, but each time we see other classrooms in another country and you see the vocabulary, this lexicon, it is really insightful and enriching for us. And all the work we are trying to do for building connection between the lexicon, for understanding the reason for the differences. For instance, comparing with the Czech lexicon, we had to come back to the Didactica Magna of Comenius centuries ago in order to understand some differences with the French lexicon. So this is really interesting to investigate and to give meaning and to exploit the lexicons.
Thank you, Michèle. We probably have time left for one last question and response. And it is the one that is being posted on the screen. And I shall let Hilary to respond to that. And the question is with regards to the use of the findings. So having access to lexicons of different countries does open the door for comparisons and judgments. I can imagine the media doing that, for example, governments doing that based on the richness of the lexicon. So the question is there a place for such superficial comparisons? And how can we make sure that these lexicons are not being misused to criticize local teaching traditions and practices?
Thank you, Wee Tiong. That's a really good question. Thank you to whoever asked that question. Look, I think with any research and any research publication, we open the door to criticism, but what we need to do is work together as a community to do all we can to ensure that the results are used appropriately. We've had similar issues, for example, in the TIMS video study that I was involved in years ago, where there was some inappropriate use of video and criticism and so on. But I think if we continue to present, just as Carmel did today, this very rich description of what the purpose of the lexicons was, and to promote uses, as Michèle just talked about, we've got the possibility of really enriching the lives of teachers and contributing to developing the profession. The book can offer so many opportunities, and I know David was such a curious person. He'd always say to Carmel and I when we're sitting outside his office, oh, imagine if we could use this with pre-service teachers. Oh, imagine if we could use this with in-service teachers and researchers. So I think, it's up to us now. We had the joy of working with David and being sort of taken on this journey with him, and we can build on his curiosity and his questions and take them forward into those different areas. And there's so much room for and possibility for how the lexicons can be used. So I think if we saw some inappropriate use, perhaps we should speak up and say that's not the intention of the work at all. The intention has always been simply to understand and to investigate and to ask questions and think about how the lexicons in other countries can inform our own practice as teachers and educators as our own. So I don't think there's a quick answer, a simple answer. There's no way to stop bad behaviour in the lexicons or in anything. But I think if we all work together to really clarify at every opportunity what the work is about and how it might well be used.
Thank you. Thanks, Hilary, for that response. And of course, as Hilary mentioned and highlighted, the spirit of David lives on through the book and through many of us in all the academic discussions, work, and deliberations that we do. Thank you all. Thank you, Michèle, Hilary, and Yiming for your insightful sharing in the last 30 minutes or so. That is all we have time for today. And thank you for the audience, to the audience too, especially for those of you who have spent as much as the last 1.5 hours with us. On behalf of all the editors, I wish you happy reading of this book. And any further question can be emailed to Carmel, whose email address should be visible in the chat function of the webinar. And Esther is typing that now. So may the last few days of 2021 treat you well, and all the best for 2022 for everyone. So keep well, keep safe, and of course, keep connected. Thank you all.